Welcome to No Holding Back with me, Susan Estridge, the podcast where I bring you the biggest names from the worlds of politics, media, and law. We dive into unfiltered, unapologetic, and insightful conversations. At least we try. I speak my mind and I encourage my guests to do the same. No topic is off limits as we dive into the issues that shape our world. With me today, I'm pleased to say, is Kyle Cheney. Kyle is a senior legal affairs reporter at Politico, where he covers the intersection of law, politics, and the courts. It's quite an intersection. Over the years, he's earned a reputation as one of the go-to voices for insights on huge stakes investigations, impeachment proceedings, and the inner workings of Congress. Whether it's dissecting the latest twists in federal investigations or breaking down the legal battles surrounding major political figures, Kyle's analysis has been a key source for understanding the complexities of American politics today. You've likely read his work covering everything from the January 6th investigation to the Mueller probe, and we're excited to get his take on everything that's happening in the world of law and politics right now. Kyle, thanks so much and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. That's probably the nicest introduction I've ever gotten, so I appreciate it.
Well, you deserve it. I read your stuff in Politico all the time. What's going on right now, Kyle? I read that they've filed like 2 or 3 times as many lawsuits the Trump campaign has as in the last election, and we've still got 2 weeks to go. What are they suing about?
Everything you can think of. I think one of the lessons they learned in 2020 was if you don't file early and often, judges are much likelier to throw out your lawsuits on various technical grounds like latches and Purcell, which are the favorite buzzwords of like basically means you filed too late. You knew this issue was going to come months ago. Why didn't you file then? So instead, what they're doing is they're filing on everything imaginable. They're still missing sometimes over filing too late, but at least now they've sort of blanketed it in every possible issue at every possible state.
What are the possible issues? I mean, everybody is doing their best, I think, to have a fair and honest election. What are they suing about?
I mean, look, there's a dividing line between truly frivolous lawsuits and I think what's sort of the normal give and take in every election year, where you're just sort of nipping around the edges of voting procedures. For example, the biggest ones this year seem to be about overseas voters, where they expect a much larger number than before. So about how states have registered and processed those voters, how they're maintaining their voter rolls. Have they done a good enough job to make sure they've weeded out, inactive voters that, to minimize potential fraud? But on the flip side of that, you don't want to start just throwing off thousands of people who might be legitimate voters. And so the fights are over whether the states are being too aggressive or not aggressive enough on that. We're not talking about massive numbers of voters, but in some closely fought states, those could matter.
So give me some examples. What are they bringing suit about, and is any of it going to be decided before Election Day?
I think some of it will. In Georgia, there's been some litigation over law rules that were promulgated by the state election board there at the last minute to sort of require election workers to hand count ballots on election night, which they all resisted, include even the Republican Secretary of State and governor said that that's not a good idea. And so that
What
actually was
happened to that, Kyle? Are they going to have to hand count ballots?
They're not. So a judge threw that out, and the groups quickly appealed to the state Supreme Court, and they went directly to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court essentially agreed with the lower court judge. Did it not entirely, but they said we're not going to deal with this during this election cycle. We will kick it off at least for a couple of months and deal with it after this election. So those rules are on hold through this election cycle. It's not going to be relevant to 2024. We're seeing fights in North Carolina over how they process ballots from overseas, and there's some active issues on that pending at the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. There are similar battles in Pennsylvania, related to that issue. I know in one case, the DOJ has sued Virginia to try to restrict their ability to throw voters off the voter rolls. Who I think the governor there has said he wants to actively be weeding out potentially invalid registrants from the rolls all the way through election day. And DOJ got involved and said, first of all, that violates sort of the provisions that prevent these kinds of actions this close to the election. And second of all, you could be capturing a universe of voters that are eligible. And so that's actually being fought in court as we speak. And I expect certain rulings on these things before Election Day.
What kind of rulings do you expect? I mean, what are you supposed to do? What's the
Well, the
best
big
practice?
I think courts are showing us that they're very reluctant to do anything that could remove eligible voters, even at the risk of leaving some ineligible voters on the lists. The flip side of removing too many voters is actually far outweighs the risk that states have left a few who shouldn't be on there. And it's not that's not even proven. It's just that you don't want to overcorrect in the wrong way. So courts are showing us that they seem reluctant to do that. So I expect where the Republican parties are demanding immediate action quickly, let us do this, or force state officials to take steps that they don't want to take. The courts seem to be saying we're not going to countenance that. I think they would rule against the party in most of those cases.
So is it all the Republicans suing or the Democrats suing too?
It depends. That depends on who's initiating the changes. So, like I said, in Virginia, the Justice Department is suing to block what the Republican governor is doing there. In other states, it's the Republicans suing to try to force the states to take action to remove people from the rolls, to clean up the voter rolls, as they put it. And there you're seeing the Democratic National Committee push back. You're seeing the state election boards push back. Georgia, the same thing. It was Democratic groups and their allies suing to stop the Georgia Election Board rules from taking effect, and they were successful in that.
So the assumption is that the Republicans are trying to get people off the voter roll, and the Democrats seem to think, what is it, that Democrats are more likely to be stricken from the voter rolls by these rules? Why is that?
Well,
Is it
you know,
racial? Is it just
it's
geography?
it's a great question because I'm not actually sure it does break down that way. You sort of think that's the logical inference of it, but in Arizona, that's one I didn't mention, where I think Republicans are suing over an issue related to a couple 100,000 voters who registered without providing a social security number or driver's licenses. These are people who registered, 30 years ago before that was actually required, and they're being sued to remove those names from the list. However, I think if you actually look underneath the hood, most of those captured in that group are Republicans. And so I'm not, so it doesn't break down the way, at least according to party, you would expect. I think in some ways it's also just about a messaging thing for Republicans to say, we're trying to clean up the voter rolls, and those Democrats are trying to leave open these potentially invalid, ineligible voters. Why are they doing that? Do they want non-citizens to vote? Do they want these fraudulent ballots come in from overseas? That's what Donald Trump is saying. So in some ways, the party's lawsuits dovetail with the messaging he's trying to put out there.
And is there any sign that you can see as somebody who watches elections and watches the law that there's a concerted pattern of non-citizens voting in this country, or is that mostly an issue that's been created for this election?
Hmm. I mean, it was actually an issue created in some ways for the last election too. Donald
Last,
Trump has used
yeah.
that messaging for a long time. I think there's always been in the sort of voter integrity, efforts on the right. There's always been this specter of, is there enough protection that we're preventing, people who shouldn't be voting from voting? Are we doing enough on that? And again, the flip side has always been more persuasive to the courts, which is, okay, yeah, if you try to eliminate one undocumented voter by striking 1,000 people from the rolls, and maybe 999 of them are eligible, you've done something worse than leaving that one person on the rolls who may not vote, by the way. There's so many deterrents out there to casting a fraudulent vote as an undocumented person. It's a felony.
It's a felony. You've got to be out of your mind. I mean, this is what I don't understand about the argument. You're an undocumented person. I would have thought, particularly with the specter of Trump, that you would want to do as little as you possibly can to draw attention to yourself, not to walk in there and demand a ballot.
Right, and that's the sort of rebuttal to this always is there's no evidence this has happened, certainly in large numbers. And I think even where it has happened in the past, usually it's an accident or mistake. It's there are states where you can register to vote in local elections, maybe there's, some confusion about that. And I think, there are examples where, maybe the DMV, you go to get an ID and you're able to do that as an undocumented person, and they check the wrong box and they put you on the voter rolls. Doesn't mean they're going to the polls and then, but I think, that's the likelier situation we've seen than some concerted effort to register undocumented people so they can go vote.
What's going to happen on November 5th at 11:30 at night? Um, it's still too close to call. Are the lawyers going to hit the courthouse the next morning? I mean, we saw that
Yeah,
last time and we were surprised. I think this time
yeah,
nobody's going to be surprised. What's going to
right.
be? What's your
I
prediction?
mean, my anticipation is that Donald Trump will declare victory one way or the other, whether he's winning or not, whether the votes are counted or not. And we certainly know in a couple of states they will not be fully counted by then. And that will trigger a whole, chain reaction. Um, because if the election is still too close to call, or it seems like things are pointing toward a Harris victory, that declaration, which again, everyone we've spoken to expects, will, I think, force a lot of legal maneuvers. I think there will be efforts to try to stop votes from being counted that have come in late. If there have been any issues with, polling locations being closed because of, whatever reason, power outages and things like that, there'll be legal efforts that night to try to extend voting hours. These are sort of normal things that do happen every 4 years, but they take on heightened significance in that atmosphere. So really, if Donald Trump doesn't seem like he's on track to victory and yet declares himself the winner, I think you'll see the party sort of race to try to take legal steps to help him ensure that again, that whatever late votes are coming in are at least coming in under challenge.
And are the Democrats ready for this? I mean, last time I think it was a surprise. We have a tradition of people respecting election results and
Right.
respecting
Your
court decisions and things like that.
your point is exactly right. They're not going to be caught flat-footed this time. Everyone is ready. I mean, Republicans are better prepared. Democrats are better prepared for the legal battles that will come pre-election day, post-election day. I just think there's nothing that is anyone's leaving to chance anymore. I mean, there were a lot of lawyers last time too, but I think the way that Donald Trump tried to exploit the system last time was a surprise. And so they're ready for all of those scenarios too, in addition to the normal routes of post-election litigation.
What kind of scenarios are you ready for, Kyle? I mean, you'll go to work. I jokingly say that the voters get done on November 5th and the lawyers will be going to work. One
Right,
way or the other, the lawyers will be going to work unless it's a landslide and nobody
right,
predicts that.
right, exactly. And look, I am I'm planning to be watchful for not a repeat of what we saw in 2020, but different iterations of that, ways that almost independent of what happens in the lawsuits or in the courts, that if Donald Trump says, I've won this election, and even if he's overturned by every court, even if every court in the country says, no, you didn't, whether he tries to exert power over other people in the process, state legislatures, members of Congress who typically abide by the results in their states, but can be pressured to do otherwise by a properly motivated candidate.
And give me that in English. Do you see that happening? What does Donald Trump do? Does he start working the phones? Does he go on
Hmm.
television and declare
Yeah,
victory? Does he
I think
attack particular states? I mean, what do they
I,
actually do?
all of the above, and I think, as you pointed out, like it will depend almost entirely on how big of a win or loss this is. Because I think if it's very close, the potential for sort of a chaotic effort like that is higher. If you're talking, in 2 or 3 states, a few thousand votes, it's much easier to stoke chaos than if you're talking about 7 states and millions of votes. But I think, assuming that very close election, yeah, I would expect Donald Trump to first urge state and county election boards not to certify the results. We can't trust these results. We think there's too many non-citizens voting. We think batches of ballots came in overnight and I don't know where they came from. And again, none of this ever comports with the reality of how these systems work. But It's enough to kick up dirt and make noise and convince enough people that the election is being stolen that it creates a pressure, an atmosphere of extreme and intense pressure.
You expect violence?
I always hate to expect violence, but I mean we saw violence 4 years ago, and I think the threat environment now is as bad or worse than it was. I think that the Justice Department is telling us, election officials are telling us they are seeing more and more intense threats than they saw even 4 years ago, and so they're worried about it. They have also taken steps to try to be more prepared, hardening their facilities, making sure they're going to have massive security presences at counting facilities, at polling places. Even when presidential electors meet, they're talking about keeping them more secure. That doesn't mean everything is impenetrable. So I think, again, depending on that pressure and that intensity of the post-election challenge, you could see that for sure.
Is there anything people can do about it? I mean, I feel sort of helpless and hopeless sometimes, helpless most of the time, hopeless some of the time, as we look at the scenario and we know what's coming, and yet, what can you do about it?
I mean, I think the answer is there's very little that the average person can do, but I think uplifting up high quality and reliable sources of information and making sure we're not sharing sort of rumor and innuendo, no matter which side, really. There's always a bit on both. I think the right has, weaponized that in 2020 in a sense to, foment these false claims of fraud that still are pervasive on that side. Um, but I think, the lifting up the voices of the election officials who are doing the counting and telling you what the facts are on the ground, making sure those facts get seen in a very noisy environment where so much disinformation is polluting everything.
Is there you're online all the time and you're following social media. How bad is it right now in terms of the disinformation that you're getting?
Well, the clearest way I can say it is the owner of Twitter, Elon Musk, is routinely amplifying disinformation about election. So, I mean, that in a nutshell tells you. I mean, he's got 200 million followers, and he sort of can drive the conversation, and he can both amplify and suppress good or bad information, and seems to have no compunction about doing that. So, I
Can
mean,
you give any examples of how he's done that you've seen personally?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen him. I'm trying to think of the latest, but I mean, he has embraced the view that Democrats' strategy is to register and enroll as many non-citizen voters as possible. That's part of their sort of long-term strategy for the nation, and so everything flows from that. So every time there's a rumor about, there's a flaw, there's a glitch in some state's registration system. He says, "Aha, that's proof that the Democrats are trying to pump up the voter rolls with non-citizen voters." When really there's much more harmless explanations for the things. And he's again weaponizing some of these normal issues that arise in every election, and turning them into the fuel for the conspiracy theorists that he's sort of strengthening.
And he's going to do that all day, election day, isn't he? I mean,
Yeah, I
every
mean
story, I mean, it's like the eating cats. I mean,
yeah,
Donald
right,
Trump now says, I was just repeating what was reported. And you want to say reported by whom? Not reported by reporters,
right,
reported by people who don't know any better
right.
and aren't telling the truth. But it's all gets shuffled in the mix there.
Mhm.
How do you sort it personally? I mean, you must have to sort through these things
Mhm.
constantly.
Well, one of the reasons I like being a legal reporter is because a lot of this gets sorted in the courtroom. I think, we saw in Nevada 4 years ago, a judge go meticulously through each of the claims of fraud and say, actually, this is why this is not correct. This is why this is not correct. This is why. I mean, we've seen some of the lawyers who engineered some of the more frivolous suits get sanctioned in bar discipline proceedings that actually were quite illuminating, and they would actually sit there and parse all of the claims they made and why most of them didn't hold up under even the slightest bit of pushback. And so the courts are where that all comes to a head. That doesn't often seep into the public consciousness, but that's where we can see, okay, you want to make a claim of fraud, put something behind it, put some meat on it, and maybe if they'd ever done that, it would be a much different conversation. But they were never able to substantiate anything significant in 2020 or in the current environment.
I was troubled to see somebody like, excuse me, Jeff Clark, who was named in a DC bar proceeding, was found to have been filing frivolous complaints, and yet his name is being circulated as somebody who the Trump administration would consider for a high post. Is there no punishment for these people?
So Jeff Clark, he's actually his bar proceedings were ones I covered closely in September, and he is fighting a 2-year suspension that the bar panel recommended. But yeah, he may get out of that. Number one, bar proceedings take forever to take effect as appeals and many layers, but that would probably last the entire Trump administration before it gets resolved. But in a sense, I think he has escaped maybe more than anybody else because the Supreme Court's immunity rulings essentially said that Trump's dealings with Jeff Clark, who at the time worked for him at DOJ, are classic immune conduct, internal discussions. And so Clark is almost untouchable in the criminal sense. He has been charged in Georgia, but that case is languishing.
Going
Um,
forward.
and he's been cut essentially out of the DC case, the federal case in DC brought by Jack Smith, because the Supreme Court basically said you can't touch him.
Right. So he is in line for an administration post, is that right?
I mean, he's been rumored for a long time as someone. I mean, he's the kind of loyalist Trump would want in that post. So I'm not sure if there's anything. I mean, there's a lot of names flying around these days as it gets closer. I don't know how reliable they are, but I think Clark is someone, again, who's shown himself to be a real loyalist, and if not attorney general, I could see Trump wanting him in, somewhere in his orbit.
It's it's scary in a way to me. The Trump lawyers are ideologues, excuse me, and this whole idea of an independent Justice Department and the Justice Department having some independence of the presidency seems to be an idea that Donald Trump doesn't give any credence to at all. Is that your impression?
Yeah, I mean, he almost will say that explicitly. He wants an attorney general who he considers a wingman who advocate for him. He wants White House counsel to advocate for him, not the institutions they represent. And he wants everything sort of tailored that way. And I think in his first term there was evidence that not only that he expected that, but that he applied pressure to get that result. And at the time, there were guardrails and people in those positions that didn't necessarily fold. But I think everyone expects that in a second Trump term, he would make sure those positions are occupied by people who he considers more reliable.
And isn't that, I mean, to me, Trump justice is a huge, frightening idea because he explicitly says that he's going to weaponize the Justice Department, that he's going to punish those who have crossed him and reward those who have done well for him. And that's a scary prospect.
Well, it is in a sense too, because I think there's still this idea that the courts can prevent the worst abuses, because at least the courts are still populated with judges who think it's their role to uphold the law and the Constitution. But I think there's also you can do a lot of harm and do a lot of damage before you ever get to a trial or a court. Who the FBI is investigating and who's getting subpoenas and having to fight those
Right.
is long before you ever get to a jury in any situation can be very significant.
And then you've got Eileen Cannon. I saw an ABC News report this week that had her number two on the list for Attorney General. I mean, Eileen Cannon, tell us about her. She's pretty scary.
Well, she's interesting. I mean, look, she is one of the last judges Trump was able to get confirmed before he left. She actually was confirmed after the 2020 election, or not confirmed, but I think she took her position after the 2020 election. And she's someone, I think, we don't know all the backstory, but she's in Fort Pierce in Southern District of Florida, and that's Trump's home district, where Mar-a-Lago is. So I think he has a special interest in who holds that position because he files so many suits, and clearly he's fending off criminal charges down there. She has shown a willingness to rule in ways that the legal community finds to be very strained in order to benefit Trump. I don't
Well,
know how
I'll
serious.
say,
Yeah,
what
I
about
don't
her
know.
ruling that Jack Smith was unconstitutionally
Right.
appointed? Isn't that a strain on the
It It's a strained reading of a lot of things that everyone expects will be overturned by the 11th Circuit. But I also think that the amount of time that has taken, I mean, actually, in fact, Trump is due to file his appeal brief to the 11th Circuit on that this week, but that is still going to be many more weeks of
Right.
resolving that. And of course, if he's president, that case will go away. Um,
Right. I mean,
and so
if
she's
he's
helped him.
president, that case goes away, and doesn't the one in DC go away as well?
Mhm. Pretty much. I mean, he can order it, with the snap of his fingers, and everyone expects that he would. So if he wins, yeah, you'd expect those cases to be unraveled. And the judge and Cannon is a big part of helping him do that because the prosecutors wanted that case to go to trial in January.
Right.
Um, she had it scheduled for May, but seemed inevitable that she was going to push it further, and here's where we are.
And then she shows up on a list as a potential attorney general. I mean, what kind of message, it seems to me, does that send to loyalists out there and
Right.
to those who enforce the rule of law, that there is no rule of law?
Yeah, and I can't tell how seriously to take that. I don't know if that's someone in Trump's world is wanting to send a signal of like, hey, thank you, we like you. I don't know if they've actually had any communication with her or that she wants anything like that. But I think, um, again, I think they view her as an ally. Certainly, Trump has made clear he views her as an ally the way he talks about her. And whether she wants that reputation or not, her rulings have essentially made that, you know, at least the Trump view of her.
And what about Trump's appointees to the court? I mean, he's taken great credit for having appointed three justices who overruled Roe v. Wade, and yet that's exploding in his face, it looks like, politically, the overruling of Roe v. Wade. You've got
Uh,
women, young women, registering to vote for that reason.
Right. And I think that is, it's double-edged because they clearly by doing what they did on Roe have energized the left in a way that could actually tip the election. But at the same time, I think as far as he's concerned, they did what he wanted on the immunity ruling, and they've helped him stave off
Yeah.
some other consequences of his own, uh, you know, criminal cases. And so I think, that's usually where his number one focus is. So he's probably very happy with the justices he appointed. Obviously, if he loses the election, then all bets are off in many other ways. But um, those criminal cases will be right back on the docket and in more full force. But I think the justices have at least done their part to minimize the chances that he faces those cases at all.
And the appointment of judges, we always used to try to make it an issue. We'd say, we're one vote away from losing this, and, you're going to appoint judges for lifetimes, and there's going to be legacies. That doesn't really work as a political issue, does it?
It has always been more animating on the right than on the left, and the
Right.
left has tried in recent cycles to change that. And I think the Roe decision has made it more salient politically, although still not. I mean, I think the Christian right, the evangelicals, have sort of viewed the court as their path to, again, overturning Roe, for example, but also affecting all kinds sorts of other policy changes, and so it's just been much more salient on the right for a long time. It's a much more organized effort to the Leonard Leo and the sort of groups that are sort of built their entire existences around shaping the court and influencing the
And
court.
they've
And
done
so,
it very effectively, I think. And I don't know that the left has caught up yet, except on the abortion issue, where it clearly
right.
has caught up. So,
And
what do you
yeah,
forecast for
go
the
ahead.
future? The Supreme Court has never been held in such low regard as it is right now. Is it going to end up deciding this election?
Whew, great question. I suspect that the justices are very wary of getting involved in ways that would be seen as radical. I think Justice Roberts, whatever you make of him, seems to want the court to be seen as a legitimate institution, and despite rulings that have eroded that, I have trouble seeing him. Like 2020, the court stayed out. They would not take up the last minute Texas lawsuit that could have been catastrophic. And they swept aside some other election challenges that seemed like they could have been more chaotic. And in some ways, the Trump world at the time in 2020 They just wanted the court to take something up, even just give it
Right.
the hint of legitimacy, and suddenly you've got an issue you can use when it comes to Congress, when it comes to pressuring people to reject electors.
Doctors, yeah.
So I think the courts are very hesitant there. And again, the lower courts are showing us right now, they're doing what they did in 2020. They're being very reluctant to do anything that would meddle in the election at the last minute, disenfranchise people. So we'll see if that flows all the way up to the high court too.
One last question, because you've been so generous with your
For sure.
time. Who's going to take the lead on both sides? Do you know who are the lawyers who are going to take the lead on the Democratic side, and who's going to take the
Sure.
lead on Trump's side? Who should we watch for?
We're kind of figuring that out now. On the Trump side, the RNC has been leading the charge on most of their litigation. Um, and I'm blanking on the names of the lawyers who are doing all the big RNC lawsuits, but they're all over the country. And the Democratic side, I mean, the Harris campaign has Mark Elias, the DNC has Don Verrilli, the former
I
Solicitor General.
I know these people.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and there, some big Seth Waxman is around doing some of these cases. I think he's arguing the North Carolina case, which just goes to oral
the
arguments on
former
Monday.
Solicitors General of the United
Mhm.
States under
Essentially,
Democratic
yes,
presidents. Yeah, they've got
exactly.
the
And
A
so
team out there.
it is truly the A team. Republicans have a good core of, legitimate election lawyers too that are bringing some of these cases. The question to me is going to be, if Trump is losing after election day, does he surround himself with the sort of more fringe lawyers, the John Eastmans of the world who led his strategy last time to
Right.
tackle more extreme types of challenges?
And do you think he will?
I do. I think there's
Rudy
some people out.
Giuliani going to be back? I don't think we'll get Rudy again, will we?
I think Rudy is he's been disbarred, so I don't think he's got the ability, even if they wanted him to. Um, but there are others out there that were in that fold in 2020 that are still around. Some who are facing sanctions, some who are not. That may be back for another round.
You're in the middle of Politico. One last question. Who's going to win?
Um,
Politico
even
has been
even
right on top of everything.
That
Anybody
that
betting
is
these
that is over
days?
my pay grade. I've done this a long time, but I don't feel qualified to answer that. I think every poll tells us it is going to be like a nail-bitingly close. It is we probably won't know on the first night. Um, and it's in some ways that's a nightmare scenario, but in other ways that's sort of how the process works now. And I think last minute, this thing could be decided by voters who haven't even made up their minds yet, and so
I
it's
know,
hard.
isn't that hard to believe?
It is,
I
isn't
find
it?
it so hard to believe. There's some joke on Facebook. It's like asking if you want chicken or chopped ice and glass and
Right.
ask how the chicken is cooked. I don't know what else people need right now. You know who the two choices are.
Well, I will say this. In 2022, everyone said there's going to be a Republican red wave. People expected that. And they also said that January 6th and these issues of democracy are not going to be salient with voters. But you know what? At the end of the day, when the results came in, Republicans had a very poor night relative to
Right,
expectations, and the
right.
democracy issue rated actually much higher among voters, especially those that made up their minds at the end, than it seemed to in the polling prior to that point. And so I think there is this idea that there are voters who will hear this stuff about Trump as an authoritarian and Trump being a danger to democracy, and say, I haven't made up my mind until now, but I'm that makes me nervous. That's what we saw
Right.
in 2022. Whether that pattern repeats in 2024, no idea. It's a different electorate.
Uh, my slogan is the one we have for Hollywood. No one knows anything.
Yep, I like that. That's
Anybody
my
who
favorite
tells
my
me they
favorite thing to
know,
say.
I just look at them and say, I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know. Is Trump underpolling himself? Is Harris going to face a sexist backlash? I have no clue. And that's pretty scary for veterans of
No one
politics.
knows anything is the thing we can all live by, I think, and then especially in the next 2 weeks.
All right. Kyle Cheney, you have been just such a pleasure. And we'll talk to you the day after the election,
Yeah.
hopefully, or right around then, and see what's really going on.
Yep,
But
we'll stay in touch. That would be great.
all right, that's wonderful. You've been listening to No Holding Back with me, Susan Estridge, and my great guest, Kyle Cheney. If you enjoyed this show, Make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also watch every episode over on our YouTube channel. Please leave a rating and review on your chosen platform. It really helps us reach more listeners and keep the conversation going. Follow us on X at No Holding Back FM, and for my weekly column, visit our website, estridgegolden.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on No Holding Back.